first settlements, and ancient roots of Mexico. When we try to imagine the beginnings of what we now call Mexico, it is helpful to think of the land itself first. Wide valleys stretching beneath silent volcanoes, thick forests alive with the murmur of birds, rivers carving their way through fertile plains, and deserts where the sun paints endless horizons. Long before names, borders, or the concept of a nation existed, this land carried a timeless presence, waiting patiently for the first people to arrive and leave their marks upon it. Archaeologists believe that the earliest humans set foot here tens of thousands of years ago. They were wanderers at first, hunters and gatherers who followed the rhythms of the seasons, moving in harmony with the great herds of animals that roamed the plains. The remains of mammoths, preserved beneath the soil, still whisper of those days. In small groups, families traveled together, carrying not much more than their tools and their stories. Theirs was a life of survival, but also one of deep connection with the natural world. Every stone tool shaped, every fire lit against the night, every footprint pressed into the earth was the start of a very long journey that would one day give rise to some of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient world. Over time, the people who lived in this vast land began to notice the patterns of the seasons with greater clarity. They watched how certain plants grew best when the rains arrived, and how seeds, when placed carefully in the soil, returned as nourishment. Slowly, farming became a possibility. The wild teosinte grass, with its small kernels, was nurtured into maize corn, the grain that would eventually become the heart of life in Mesoamerica. This shift from wandering hunters to settled farmers marked one of the great transformations of human history. Villages emerged, built from simple huts of mud and reeds. Families stayed in one place, cultivating not only crops, but also traditions, rituals, and beliefs. Corn was not merely food. For these early communities, it was sacred. It symbolized life itself, a gift from the earth and the gods. Stories told by the fireside described humans as beings made from maize, shaped from its dough, and given spirit by divine breath. In this way, agriculture was never only about survival. It was about identity, spirituality, and a sense of belonging to the land. As villages grew, people began to look upward as much as they looked down into the soil. The stars became guides, the moon a calendar, the sun a powerful source of meaning. They noticed how the movements in the sky matched the cycles of planting and harvest. Over generations, the first steps toward astronomy and timekeeping emerged. Life was no longer simply about the present day, but about weaving human existence into the greater rhythm of the cosmos. And so, in the slow unfolding of centuries, the foundations of civilization began to appear. In certain places, people learned to shape clay into pottery, decorating vessels with patterns that reflected their beliefs. They crafted figurines that seemed to hold prayers within their silent forms. They built communal spaces where neighbors gathered not only to share food, but to honor forces greater than themselves. These were the quiet beginnings of what would later blossom into great cities and empires. One of the earliest cultures to leave a distinct mark on Mexico's ancient history was the Olmec, though they would come later in the timeline. For now, in these first chapters of human settlement, we are still within a time before names and empires. The people lived in harmony with the rivers, valleys, and coasts. They fished, hunted, and cultivated. They learned to weave fibers into mats and clothing, to build canoes for travel along waterways, and to create simple trade networks with neighboring groups. We can picture the scene: the crackle of firelight under a night sky heavy with stars, children listening to elders telling tales of animals that became gods, of spirits who guided the rains, of ancestors who walked alongside them in dreams. These stories carried wisdom, and more importantly, continuity. For in a world without written words, memory was everything. Each story was like a thread binding generations together, ensuring that no one was truly lost as long as their voice lived on in the tale. Over time, the first hints of social organization appeared. Some individuals gained respect for their knowledge of planting, others for their skills in hunting or crafting tools. Leaders emerged, not as rulers in the sense we think of today, but as guides people trusted to make decisions for the well-being of the community. Rituals, too, became more complex. Offerings were made to the earth for fertility, to the skies for rain, to the fire for warmth and protection. Life was lived within a sacred balance, where the human and the divine were never far apart. In certain areas, we find the earliest evidence of monumental construction: simple platforms, mounds, and ceremonial spaces. These were not yet the towering pyramids of later times, but they carried the seed of that idea: the desire to create a place where human effort reached toward the heavens, where the boundary between the world of people and the world of the gods could blur. Centuries passed in this slow but steady unfolding. The people of early Mexico deepened their relationship with maize, with beans, with squash, with chili peppers, foods that became staples of life. These crops did more than nourish the body, they nourished society. With reliable food sources, populations grew. Villages became larger, trade became richer, and the flow of ideas between groups became stronger. Out of this exchange, culture blossomed. Music, dance, art, and belief systems that intertwined the earthly and the celestial. And so, when we speak of the roots of Mexico, we are not simply referring to the beginnings of a political state. We are speaking of something much deeper: a spiritual heritage, a way of seeing the world that honors cycles, balance, and connection. This heritage is the soil from which later civilizations would rise, civilizations like the Olmecs, the Mayas, and the Aztecs. But before those names filled the history books, there was this quiet age of beginnings, where each sunrise was both a gift and a mystery, and where the seeds of maize carried within them the promise of entire worlds to come. In this way, the story of Mexico begins not with conquest or empire, but with the humble act of planting a seed, watching it grow, and recognizing in that growth the reflection of human life itself. From small villages to the first ceremonial centers, from stories told by firelight to patterns etched in the stars, the people of early Mexico built a foundation of resilience, wisdom, and beauty. It is upon this foundation that all the later chapters of Mexican history would be built. A reminder that even the greatest civilizations begin with something as simple and as sacred as the earth beneath our feet. And as we let this image settle in our minds, the quiet villages, the maize fields swaying in the wind, the stars guiding farmers and dreamers alike, we are gently led forward toward the next chapter, where the first great culture of Mesoamerica will rise. The Olmecs, the so-called Mother Civilization, whose colossal stone heads and mysterious symbols still watch over the memory of time. As the centuries passed and the early villages of Mexico grew in strength and spirit, a new chapter began to unfold. Out of the fertile lands of the Gulf Coast, between rivers and lush forests, a culture emerged that would leave an imprint so deep it would echo across all of Mesoamerica. These were the Olmecs, often called the Mother Civilization, for their influence reached far beyond their own time, shaping the foundations upon which later cultures would rise. To picture the Olmecs is to imagine a people surrounded by abundance. The region they inhabited, in what is now Veracruz and Tabasco, was a place of dense greenery, of rivers winding like serpents, of fertile earth that yielded generous harvests. Here, the maize fields flourished, but so too did cacao trees, fruits, and wild resources. This environment supported not only survival, but the possibility of complexity. The building of centers where life was no longer just about food and shelter, but about art, belief, and the expression of power. What strikes us most about the Olmecs are their monumental works. Even today, scattered across the land, colossal stone heads gaze silently into the horizon. Carved from basalt, some weighing many tons, they are masterpieces of strength and mystery. Each face is distinct, as though representing individuals of great importance, perhaps rulers or warriors, whose memory was preserved not in fragile words, but in enduring stone. To stand before one of these heads is to feel a presence, an echo of lives lived 3,000 years ago, preserved in rock. The Olmecs were not only sculptors, but visionaries of space and ritual. They constructed ceremonial centers, places where life and the cosmos met. At San Lorenzo and La Venta, we find the remains of great platforms, plazas, and pyramid-like structures. These were not cities in the sense of later times, bustling with markets and crowded streets, but sacred landscapes, carefully arranged to reflect cosmic order. In their design, we can already see the seeds of what would later become the grand urban centers of Teotihuacan and the Maya cities. Religion for the Olmecs was woven into every aspect of life. Their art reveals beings both human and divine, creatures that blend the jaguar with man, symbols of fertility, rain, and transformation. The jaguar, powerful and elusive, became a sacred figure, a bridge between the human world and the mysteries of nature. Through rituals, offerings, and perhaps even bloodletting, the Olmecs sought to maintain harmony with forces greater than themselves. Life was seen as part of a delicate balance, a conversation between earth, sky, water, and spirit. And just as they looked to the natural world for symbols, they also looked to the heavens. The Olmecs are believed to have studied the movements of the sun and the stars, creating early forms of calendars and rituals tied to celestial cycles. Farming and faith intertwined, for to know when to plant and when to harvest was as much a spiritual act as it was a practical one. In this way, time itself became sacred, a rhythm that guided both daily tasks and sacred ceremonies. The Olmecs were also pioneers of writing and numbers. Small symbols carved on stones and artifacts may represent some of the earliest attempts at recording words or ideas in Mesoamerica. Though their full meaning remains hidden to us, these signs whisper of a people reaching beyond memory, striving to capture thought in a form that could endure. Alongside this, they developed systems of counting, using dots and bars, laying the groundwork for the complex mathematics later perfected by the Maya. But the Olmecs were not isolated. Through rivers and coastlines, they created networks of exchange, trading obsidian, jade, cacao, and feathers. Their influence spread across distant regions, carried in the form of ideas, motifs, and technologies. Archaeologists have found Olmec-style carvings far beyond their heartland, a sign that their vision traveled with traders, priests, and wanderers. In this way, the Olmecs became not just a local people, but a source of inspiration across Mesoamerica, a cultural current flowing silently through time. If we pause for a moment to imagine life in an Olmec ceremonial center, we might hear the sound of drums and flutes during a ritual gathering. The scent of burning copal resin would fill the air as offerings were laid upon stone altars. Children would watch wide-eyed as priests donned jaguar masks, their chants rising like a bridge between the human and the divine. Farmers, artisans, and rulers alike would gather, bound together by belief and tradition. These moments were not separate from daily life. They were the very fabric of existence, weaving community into cosmos. The Olmecs also left behind smaller, yet no less powerful works of art. Jade figurines, polished and luminous, revealed delicate human faces with serene expressions, as though caught in timeless meditation. These artifacts, sometimes buried in ceremonial caches, speak of reverence for ancestors, for gods, for the mysterious forces of creation. Through stone, the Olmecs gave form to the invisible, leaving behind a legacy of beauty and mystery. And like all civilizations, the Olmecs eventually changed, declined, and gave way to new powers. The great centers of San Lorenzo and La Venta faded, perhaps due to shifting rivers, changing climates, or social transformations. Yet their spirit did not vanish. Instead, their ideas, their symbols, their ways of seeing the world flowed onward, absorbed and transformed by the cultures that followed. In this way, the Olmecs remain present, not as a vanished people, but as ancestors whose voices still echo through the art, the architecture, and the beliefs of later civilizations. To speak of them is to acknowledge that no culture stands alone. Just as a river is fed by countless streams, so too was Mesoamerican history nourished by the Olmecs. They were the first to shape stone into colossal memory, the first to build sacred centers of power, the first to articulate the sacred language of symbols and signs. They showed that human hands, guided by vision, could create works that reached beyond time. And so, as we let the image of those colossal heads linger in our minds, silent guardians of a vanished age, gazing across millennia with unblinking eyes, we find ourselves drawn gently toward what came after. The Olmecs lit the torch, and others carried it forward. Out of their influence would rise new centers, new peoples, and new expressions of the same timeless desire to live not just on the earth, but within the cosmos. In the distance, another city begins to take shape. A city so vast and mysterious, it would one day be called the place where the gods were born. With its towering pyramids and grand avenues, it would become a beacon of Mesoamerican civilization. This was Teotihuacan, and to it we now turn, carried forward by the flow of history that began with the Olmecs and now rises to new heights. Out of the legacy of the Olmecs and the slow unfolding of centuries, there rose a city unlike any that had come before. It was a place that seemed to embody the very idea of eternity, where human hands shaped earth and stone into avenues and pyramids so vast that they still inspire awe today. This city was Teotihuacan, known to later peoples as the place where the gods were born. To imagine Teotihuacan in its prime is to imagine a vision realized on a grand scale. Set in the highlands of central Mexico, in a valley surrounded by mountains and volcanoes, the city grew to become one of the largest in the ancient world. By the first centuries of our era, it was home to perhaps 200,000 people, artisans, priests, traders, farmers, and rulers, all living within a carefully planned grid of streets and plazas. This was not the organic growth of scattered villages. It was deliberate, as though the city itself was a sacred design drawn from the heavens and etched onto the earth. At the heart of Teotihuacan stretched the great Avenue of the Dead, a broad thoroughfare lined with temples, plazas, and ceremonial complexes. Walking along it, one would be dwarfed by the monumental structures rising on either side. Most striking were the pyramids of the sun and the moon, vast stair-stepped mountains of stone that seemed to reach toward the sky. Climbing their heights, one could look out over the city and beyond, to the mountains that framed the horizon, and feel the sense of being at the center of something both human and divine. The Pyramid of the Sun, in particular, carries a presence that even now, after centuries of ruin and silence, radiates mystery. Beneath it, tunnels and chambers suggest rituals, offerings, and perhaps even burials that connected the pyramid to the underworld. Above it, the structure aligned with celestial events, linking the city to the rhythms of the sun. In this way, the pyramid was not just a monument, but a bridge between earth and sky, between human life and cosmic order. Yet Teotihuacan was not only about monumental architecture. It was a city of neighborhoods, each with its own compounds, courtyards, and murals. Families lived in multi-room apartments built of stone, decorated with bright paintings that still survive today. These murals depict gods, animals, and symbolic imagery, offering glimpses into the beliefs and daily life of the people. One can almost picture children playing in courtyards, artisans carving obsidian tools, traders carrying goods into the bustling markets, priests preparing for ceremonies, and farmers bringing harvests from the surrounding fields. Trade was the lifeblood of Teotihuacan. From its markets flowed obsidian blades, fine pottery, colorful textiles, and exotic goods brought from distant lands. Feathers from tropical birds, shells from coastal shores, and cacao beans for sacred drinks all passed through its streets. In return, Teotihuacan's influence spread outward, carried along trade routes into Maya lands and beyond. Archaeologists have discovered Teotihuacan-style artifacts and architecture far from the city itself, proof that its reach was vast and its prestige immense. Religion and power were intertwined at Teotihuacan. The city's rulers remain mysterious, their names lost to time, yet their vision is clear in the way the city was designed. Temples and pyramids aligned with celestial events, suggesting a priestly elite deeply attuned to the cosmos. Murals and sculptures reveal deities connected to rain, fertility, fire, and creation. One of the most striking figures is the so-called Great Goddess, a powerful female deity associated with earth and water, depicted as a source of abundance and life. Through such symbols, the people of Teotihuacan expressed their understanding of existence as part of a greater, divine order. And like all great cities, Teotihuacan was a place of contrasts. Its grandeur suggests wealth and power, but its ruins also whisper of inequality, of rulers and priests living differently from common laborers. Yet even so, there was a sense of shared purpose in the city's design, a collective participation in something larger than any individual. Each stone placed, each mural painted, each ritual performed was part of sustaining a world where the human and the divine were inseparably linked. What is most fascinating is that even the Aztecs, who lived many centuries later, regarded Teotihuacan with awe. When they discovered its ruins, long abandoned, they believed it was the place where the gods had gathered to create the sun and the moon, to set the cosmos into motion. To them, the city was not human at all, but divine, a reminder that its builders had touched eternity in some way. And so the name endured, Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. Yet even the greatest cities are not eternal. Around the 6th century, Teotihuacan began to decline. The reasons remain uncertain. Some suggest drought or environmental stress, others internal unrest or invasion. Fires swept through parts of the city, and over time, its once crowded avenues grew silent. The pyramids, once alive with ritual, stood empty under the sky. And yet, even in abandonment, Teotihuacan did not vanish. Its memory lived on, carried in stories, in influence, and in the stones themselves, waiting for later peoples to rediscover them. To reflect on Teotihuacan is to reflect on human ambition and vision. It was not merely a city of stone, but a city of meaning, where architecture embodied beliefs, where life was woven into cosmic rhythms, and where generations lived under the shadow of pyramids that touched the heavens. Its influence reached far beyond its fall, inspiring the Maya, the Toltecs, and the Aztecs, each of whom carried forward fragments of its legacy. And so, as we let the image of Teotihuacan settle into our minds, the Avenue of the Dead stretching into the distance, the pyramids rising against the backdrop of mountains, the murals glowing with sacred colors, we find ourselves gently guided onward. Beyond Teotihuacan, another people were rising, in the forests and plains of the Yucatan and beyond. They would perfect calendars, map the skies with astonishing precision, and write their histories in glyphs carved into stone. These were the Maya, and to them we now turn as the story of Mexico unfolds ever further, as Teotihuacan's pyramids cast their long shadows across the valley. Far to the southeast, in the lush forests and rolling hills of the Yucatan and Central America, another civilization was rising. It was a world of dense jungles, rivers winding like serpents, and limestone plains where rain disappeared into hidden caves. In this landscape, the Maya built their cities, their temples, and their cosmic vision. The Maya are remembered today not only for their towering pyramids and grand plazas, but for something even deeper, their extraordinary knowledge. They were keepers of time, watchers of the heavens, and storytellers of creation. In their world, everything from the growth of maize to the movements of the stars was bound together in patterns that revealed the harmony of the cosmos. To imagine a Maya city is to picture temples rising above the jungle canopy, their stairways leading skyward, their tops crowned with shrines where priests observed the stars. Below, plazas filled with people, traders offering cacao beans, artisans selling jade ornaments, families gathering for festivals, and nobles overseeing the life of the city. The air would carry the sound of flutes and drums, the scent of incense, and the color of murals painted with bright reds, blues, and yellows. What made the Maya unique was their writing. Unlike earlier cultures who left only symbols and hints, the Maya developed a true script of hieroglyphs, able to capture not only names and numbers, but entire histories, prayers, and stories. Carved into stone stele, painted in codices, inscribed on pottery, their words brought permanence to memory. Through them, we can still hear the voices of kings, priests, and poets speaking across more than 1,000 years. Their mathematics was no less remarkable. With a system based on the number 20, and with the revolutionary concept of zero, the Maya could calculate with a precision that astonished later generations. This knowledge gave rise to their famous calendars, which tracked the cycles of the sun, the moon, Venus, and the sacred rhythms of ritual life. For the Maya, time was not linear, but cyclical, a great wheel turning endlessly, in which each day carried its own meaning, its own destiny. We can imagine a Maya priest standing atop a temple at dawn, watching the rising sun. With careful calculations, he would know not only the day, but its sacred significance, the rituals it required, the energies it carried. In this way, the Maya did not merely observe time, they lived within it, as though woven into the fabric of the universe itself. Their myths reflected this vision. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of creation, the story is told of gods who shaped humans first from mud, then from wood, and finally from maize dough. Only when people were formed from maize did they endure, a reflection of the deep truth that maize was life itself. To eat maize was not only to live, but to partake of the sacred essence of humanity. The Maya also built cities of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Places like Tikal, Palenque, Capan, and Chichén Itzá stand as testaments to their skill. Each city was not only a political center, but a sacred landscape, carefully aligned with celestial events. At Chichén Itzá, during the equinox, the shadow of the serpent god Kukulkan appears to slither down the steps of the Great Pyramid, a marriage of stone and sunlight, architecture and astronomy. These were not coincidences. They were deliberate, expressions of a worldview in which the divine and the earthly danced together. And yet, within this grandeur, the Maya were also deeply human. Their art captures moments of intimacy, kings cradling infants, scribes bent over books, warriors preparing for battle, ball players poised on courts where sport and ritual merged. The Maya ball game, played with a rubber ball on stone courts, was more than entertainment. It was a ritual echo of cosmic struggle, sometimes involving offerings or even sacrifice, a reminder that life and death were inseparably linked. Sacrifice itself played a role in Maya religion. Blood, seen as a vital essence, was offered in rituals to nourish the gods. Kings and queens performed bloodletting ceremonies, drawing their own blood with stingray spines or obsidian blades, an act of devotion and responsibility. These rituals were not acts of cruelty, but of communion, binding human life to divine order. The Maya world was not a single empire, but a mosaic of city-states, each with its own rulers, dynasties, and rivalries. Kings, called Aja, traced their lineage to divine ancestors and ruled as mediators between gods and people. They commissioned stelae to record their reigns, celebrated victories, and honored the cycles of time. Wars erupted between rival cities. Alliances were forged and broken. Yet through it all, the culture endured, bound by shared beliefs and traditions. Trade connected these cities, weaving the Maya world together. Obsidian, jade, cacao, feathers, and salt flowed along routes stretching from the highlands to the coasts. Ideas traveled too, as artisans, scribes, and priests exchanged knowledge. In this network, the Maya world became a tapestry of shared creativity, each city adding its own colors and designs. And though centuries passed, the Maya never lost their reverence for the cosmos. Their calendars extended far beyond the cycles of a single lifetime, measuring spans of thousands of years. To them, human life was but one moment in a grand cosmic rhythm. Even endings were not final, but part of a greater turning, a preparation for renewal. Eventually, many great Maya cities declined. Around the 9th century, some centers in the southern lowlands were abandoned. The reasons remain a mystery. Perhaps drought, overpopulation, warfare, or shifting trade routes. Temples fell silent, plazas emptied, and the jungle slowly reclaimed the stones. Yet the Maya people themselves did not vanish. Their descendants still live across the Yucatan, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, carrying with them language, traditions, and a heritage that endures to this day. To speak of the Maya is to speak of wisdom, a wisdom written in glyphs, measured in stars, and whispered in the rustling of maize. Their vision of time, their art, their architecture, all remind us that human life can be lived in harmony with the cosmos, as part of cycles greater than ourselves. And so, as the shadows lengthen over the ruins of Tikal, and the serpent descends the steps of Chichén Itzá, we are carried gently forward once more. Beyond the Maya, in the valleys of central Mexico, a new power would rise, the Toltecs, guardians of myth and warriors of legend, whose influence would echo into the age of the Aztecs, as the great cities of the Maya flourished in the forests and slowly gave way to silence. Another power was stirring in the valleys of central Mexico. Out of the shifting landscape of the post-Teotihuacan world, where old traditions lingered and new ones emerged, the Toltecs rose to prominence. Their story is not only one of warriors and rulers, but of myth, memory, and transformation. To speak of the Toltecs is to enter a realm where history and legend blend seamlessly, where the lines between what was and what was dreamed blur into a single vision. The Toltecs made their home in the city of Tula, also known as Tollan. Nestled in the highlands, it became a center of power, culture, and spirituality between the 10th and 12th centuries. To walk through its ruins today is to encounter massive stone columns carved into the shapes of warriors, standing tall as though still guarding the heart of their city. These Atlantean figures, as they are called, are reminders of the Toltecs' martial character and their sense of cosmic duty. Tula was not as vast as Teotihuacan had once been, nor as intricately adorned as the Maya cities, yet it held a unique presence. It was a city of plazas, temples, and ball courts, where rituals unfolded beneath the sky. At its center stood the pyramid of Quetzalcoatl, adorned with serpentine motifs, and guarded by those great warrior statues. The city reflected both strength and spirituality, a union of earthly might and divine connection. The Toltecs were remembered as skilled artisans and builders, creators of fine obsidian blades, painted vessels, and intricate sculptures. They wove textiles that carried patterns rich with meaning, and their art spoke of gods, battles, and transformations. But more than their works, it was their philosophy, their vision of life, that gave them a lasting place in the memory of Mesoamerica. Central to their legacy is the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. To the Toltecs, Quetzalcoatl was both god and culture hero, a bringer of knowledge, a patron of the arts, a teacher of wisdom. Stories tell of a priest king named Quetzalcoatl, who ruled with justice and sought to guide his people toward harmony. He was said to have opposed human sacrifice, favoring offerings of flowers, butterflies, and incense instead. Under his reign, Tolan was imagined as a place of abundance, peace, and enlightenment. Yet myth also tells of conflict. In the Tales, Quetzalcoatl faced opposition from dark forces, embodied by the god Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. Through trickery and temptation, Quetzalcoatl was brought down, his era ending in exile. He was said to have journeyed east across the sea, with the promise that one day he would return. This story would echo through the centuries, shaping later events in ways no one at the time could have imagined. The Toltec worldview was steeped in dualities: light and darkness, creation and destruction, wisdom and war. They saw the world as a balance between opposing forces, and their rituals reflected this understanding. Sacrifice, both symbolic and real, played a role in maintaining cosmic order. Though some traditions describe the Toltecs as wise philosophers, others recall them as fierce warriors who demanded tribute and engaged in conquest. Perhaps both are true, for human societies are rarely only one thing. Tula itself became a model for later peoples. The Aztecs, who rose centuries later, looked back on the Toltecs with deep admiration. To them, the Toltecs were the height of culture, the guardians of knowledge, the ones who set the standard for art, architecture, and governance. To be Toltec was not simply to belong to a people. It was to embody excellence, to live with wisdom and skill. In Aztec speech, to call someone Toltec was the highest form of praise. This reverence shows us that the Toltecs lived not only in their own time, but in the imagination of generations to come. Their myths became the myths of Mesoamerica. Their city of Tolan became a symbol, sometimes real, sometimes legendary, a shining example of what human life could aspire to. Even as Tula itself declined, their influence grew in story and memory, spreading far beyond the stones of their city. Why did the Toltec city fade? As with many civilizations, the reasons are layered. Some speak of internal strife, others of invasion by northern tribes, still others of ecological pressures. Whatever the cause, by the 12th century, Tula had lost its power. Its plazas emptied, its statues stood in silence, and the age of the Toltecs as rulers came to an end. Yet, in decline, as in life, they left something enduring, an identity woven into the fabric of Mesoamerican culture. To imagine the Toltecs is to stand among their warrior statues at dusk, the sky glowing with the fatting sun. The air is still, and yet there is a presence, the weight of myth, of memory, of lives lived in devotion to something greater. One can almost hear the echoes of flutes, the calls of priests, the chants of warriors, and the whispers of philosophers contemplating the mysteries of existence. And so the Toltecs occupy a special place in the story of Mexico. They are both history and dream, both rulers of a city and symbols of a golden age. Their myths remind us that civilizations are not only measured by stones or armies, but by the stories they leave behind, the ideals they inspire, and the ways they live on in the hearts of those who come after. As we let the memory of the Toltecs settle, we find ourselves moving forward once more. Beyond Tula, new powers were rising. In the heart of the Valley of Mexico, a people would emerge whose empire would dwarf all that had come before. They would build a city on water, create an empire of tribute, and leave behind legends of gods and warriors that still resonate today. These were the Aztecs, and their story now awaits us, shining like a jewel upon the waters of Lake Texcoco. From the fading echoes of the Toltecs, a new power slowly emerged in the heart of the Valley of Mexico. Out of wandering tribes, myths, and determination, a people would rise who carried the memory of Tolan in their hearts, who called themselves heirs to that ancient wisdom, and who built a city on water that would become one of the most extraordinary in human history. These were the Mexica, whom the world came to know as the Aztecs. Their journey began not in grandeur, but in hardship. The Mexica were a nomadic people, moving across the rugged landscapes of northern Mexico, carrying with them a prophecy that their god, Huitzilopochtli, would guide them to a promised land. They endured hunger, rejection, and exile. Other settled peoples often looked upon them as outsiders, rough and unwanted, forcing them to live in marshes or barren places. Yet the Mexica endured, for they believed in the voice of their God and the promise of destiny. That destiny revealed itself in a vision. According to their sacred story, the Mexica were told to look for a sign: an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. When they reached the marshy shores of Lake Texcoco, they saw that sign upon a small island, and there, in 1325, they began to build their city, Tenochtitlan. At first, it was modest, a cluster of huts and canals on swampy ground. But the Mexica transformed the lake into their strength. They drove wooden stakes into the shallow waters, creating foundations. They built chinempas, floating gardens, where maize, beans, squash, and flowers grew in abundance. They raised causeways to connect their island to the mainland, and canals that allowed canoes to glide through the heart of the city. Slowly, the marshland blossomed into an urban masterpiece. As Tenochtitlan grew, so did the Mexica's ambition. Through alliances and warfare, they expanded their power. In 1428, they formed the Triple Alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, creating a confederation that would dominate central Mexico. Tribute flowed into their capital: cacao, cotton, feathers, gold, jade, obsidian, and food from every region. The empire became a network of trade, tribute, and cultural exchange. stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific and deep into the South. Life in Tenochtitlan was vibrant. Markets like Tlayhtlalco bustled with thousands of traders, offering goods from across Mesoamerica. Artisans shaped turquoise mosaics, feather headdresses, and obsidian blades. Priests tended to the great temples, keeping the calendar of rituals that aligned human life with the cosmos. Warriors trained for campaigns, their ranks divided into jaguar knights and eagle warriors, each with its own symbols and honors. At the center of the city stood the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, a massive double pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. It was here that rituals unfolded, where offerings were made to sustain the balance of the universe. The Aztecs believed that the sun itself required nourishment in the form of sacrifice, that without human hearts and blood, the cosmos would fall into darkness. This belief, while harsh to us, was to them a sacred duty, a way of ensuring the continuation of life. Yet the Aztecs were more than warriors and priests. They were also poets, philosophers, and dreamers. Their language, Nahuatl, carried metaphors rich with beauty. Flowers and songs in Xochitl, in Cuicatl, were their symbols of truth. Poets like Nezahualcoatl of Texcoco composed verses that pondered the brevity of life, the mystery of existence, the search for meaning in a fleeting world. In their songs, they asked, "Is it true one really lives on the earth? Not forever on earth, only a little while here." Such words remind us that beneath the grandeur of empire lay hearts and minds deeply attuned to the fragility of being human. Education was valued. Children of nobles and commoners alike were taught history, religion, warfare, and crafts. The Comicak schools prepared the sons of nobles for leadership, while the Tolpachcali trained commoners in discipline, duty, and skills. Girls learned weaving, cooking, and ritual practices. Knowledge was passed down through codices, painted manuscripts filled with symbols and colors that told the stories of gods, kings, and cycles of time. The Aztec Empire was also an empire of contrasts. Great wealth and abundance flowed into the capital, but tribute often came at the cost of resentment among subject peoples. The demands of the empire were heavy, and not all were willing to bear them. Some regions gave their goods reluctantly, others resisted openly, waiting for a chance to break free. This tension lay beneath the surface of Aztec power, a quiet crack in the foundation of their greatness. Still, at its height in the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan was a wonder of the world. Its population may have reached 200,000 or more, rivaling the largest cities of Europe at the time. Canals shimmered with sunlight, causeways bustled with travelers, temples towered above the skyline, and markets overflowed with goods. Visitors marveled at its order, its beauty, and its ingenuity. The Mexica, once wanderers without a home, had created a jewel upon the lake. To walk its streets in those days would have been to hear the sound of drums and flutes from the temples, the laughter of children in the courtyards, the calls of merchants at the market, the rhythm of paddles in the canals. it would have been to smell flowers from the chinampas, incense from the altars, and the smoke of hearths where maize was turned into tortillas. It was a city alive with spirit, with culture, with the pulse of human life in its many forms. And yet, even as the Aztec Empire reached its zenith, forces from beyond the horizon were moving closer. Strange sails had begun to appear on distant coasts, carried by winds from across the ocean. The promise of Quetzalcoatl's return lingered in memory, and whispers of omens spread among the people. The world of the Aztecs was magnificent, but it stood on the edge of a destiny it could not foresee. The story of the Aztecs, then, is not only about their rise, but also about the twilight that awaited them. Their greatness was undeniable, their achievements extraordinary, their vision profound. They inherited the myths of the Toltecs, transformed them into living institutions, and left behind a city that continues to amaze us even in ruins. Their time was brief in the vast scope of history. Yet, in that brief span, they created something eternal. As night falls over the lake and the last light fades from the temples, we can imagine the city glowing with torches, the water reflecting the stars, the people carrying out their lives beneath the gaze of their gods. The Mexica remind us that even the greatest empires are but moments in the flow of time. And yet, in their beauty, in their poetry, in their memory, they live on forever. And so, from the rise of Tenochtitlan, our journey continues. Ahead lies a new encounter, one that will reshape not only the fate of the Mexica, but the destiny of an entire continent. For across the sea, the ships of Spain were drawing near, bringing with them a meeting of worlds that would forever alter the story of Mexico. The Aztec Empire, at the height of its power, shone like a jewel upon the waters of Lake Texcoco. Its markets overflowed with goods. Its temples towered toward the heavens. Its canals carried life and beauty through the heart of the city. But across the great ocean to the east, a different world had been moving, one of sails, muskets, and ambition. And in the early years of the 16th century, these two worlds, each rich in its own history, would meet in an encounter that changed the course of time forever. The story begins with the Spanish voyages of exploration. After Columbus's journeys, Spain looked westward with hunger for land, wealth, and glory. Explorers reached the Caribbean islands, then the coasts of Central America. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, a man of both determination and cunning, set sail from Cuba with a small fleet. He had a few hundred soldiers, some horses, and a thirst for conquest. Compared to the vast might of the Mexica, his force was tiny. Yet the path of history often turns on small beginnings. When the Spanish first landed on the shores of Veracruz, they were struck by the richness of the land. They encountered peoples who lived under the shadow of Aztec power, some of whom resented the heavy tribute demanded by Tenochtitlan. Cortés quickly realized that alliances would be the key to his success. With diplomacy, promises, and sometimes force, he gathered allies, most importantly the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who had long resisted Aztec dominance. Among Cortés's greatest advantages was a woman known to history as Melansin, or La Malinche. She was given to the Spaniards as a translator, for she spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Maya, which could be bridged to Spanish. More than a translator, she became an advisor, a guide, and a figure whose role has been debated for centuries. To some, she was a traitor to others, a survivor who navigated impossible choices. Her presence made it possible for Cortés to communicate, negotiate, and manipulate the complex web of politics that surrounded the Aztecs. As the Spaniards advanced inland, they encountered awe and suspicion. The Mexica had prophecies of strange omens, comets in the sky, temples burning without cause, the sudden appearance of mysterious creatures. Some interpreted these signs as foretelling the return of Quetzalcoatl, the exiled god-king. When word reached Emperor Moctezuma II of the newcomers, with their bearded faces, thunderous weapons, and animals never before seen, horses, he hesitated. Should he treat them as mortals or as divine messengers? Moctezuma was a ruler of great ceremony, cautious and deliberate. His city was the heart of a vast empire, and he carried the weight of its destiny. Yet his hesitation became a weakness. While he debated how to respond, Cortés pressed forward, gathering allies and learning more about the land. The Spaniards marched steadily toward the Valley of Mexico, their small numbers multiplied by thousands of indigenous warriors who saw in them a chance to break free of Aztec power. When at last Cortés and his men reached Tenochtitlan, they were awed. The city seemed to float upon the lake, gleaming with temples and palaces, crisscrossed with canals alive with canoes. European visitors later compared it to Venice, though it was larger, more vibrant, and unlike anything they had known. Moctezuma received Cortés with gifts of gold, food, and finery, welcoming him into the city. Yet beneath the courtesy lay tension, mistrust, and a growing awareness that these strangers were not content to be guests. In a bold move, Cortés seized Moctezuma and held him under house arrest, ruling the city through its emperor. The Spaniards demanded treasure, stripped temples of gold, and desecrated sacred images. Tensions rose until, during a religious festival, Spanish soldiers attacked and killed unarmed Aztec nobles and priests. The city erupted in fury. The Mexica rose against the Spaniards, surrounding them within the city. Stones and spears rained down from rooftops. Canals became battlegrounds, and the air filled with cries of anger. Moctezuma, sent to calm his people, was struck, some say by his own subjects, others by the Spaniards themselves. He died soon after, a ruler caught between worlds, remembered with sorrow and ambiguity. The Spaniards, now trapped, made their desperate escape on a night remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. They fled across the causeways in the darkness, carrying stolen treasure, pursued by Aztec warriors. Many Spaniards and their allies drowned in the lake, dragged down by the weight of gold. The survivors, bloodied and broken, retreated to regroup. Yet this was not the end. Cortés rebuilt his strength with the help of his indigenous allies, especially the Tlaxcalans. Disease also entered the land. Smallpox, carried by the Spaniards, spread rapidly among the Mexica, killing thousands and weakening the empire. When Cortés returned to lay siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521, the balance had shifted. The siege was brutal and relentless. The Spaniards cut off the causeways, blockaded the lake, and destroyed the aqueducts that brought fresh water. They attacked by land and with brigantines, small ships built to control the waters. Inside the city, the Mexica resisted fiercely under the leadership of Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor who took command after Moctezuma's death. He became a symbol of courage, urging his people to fight for their home. Day after day, battle raged. The canals filled with corpses, temples were burned, and famine gripped the city. Yet the Mexica fought with unyielding spirit, refusing to surrender even as hunger and disease consumed them. Only after months of suffering did the defenses finally collapse. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured, and Tenochtitlan fell. The city that had been a jewel upon the lake now lay in ruins. Its temples toppled, its people scattered. The Spanish conquest was complete, and with it, a new chapter of history began. For the Mexica, it was a time of devastation, loss, and sorrow beyond measure. For the Spaniards, it was the birth of New Spain, the foundation of colonial rule that would last for centuries. And yet, even in defeat, the spirit of the Mexica did not vanish. Their poetry, their stories, their traditions endured. Cuauhtémoc, though captured and eventually executed, was remembered as a hero, a symbol of resistance and dignity. The ruins of Tenochtitlan became the foundation of Mexico City, where ancient stones still whisper of the empire that once was. The conquest was not a single moment, but a transformation, painful, violent, and complex. It brought together two worlds that had never before touched, worlds of different gods, languages, and dreams. From that collision, a new Mexico was born, neither wholly Spanish nor wholly indigenous, but a blending that would continue to shape its identity for centuries. And so, as we close this chapter, we feel the weight of what was lost and the seeds of what was to come. The Aztec Empire had fallen, yet its memory lived on in song, in stone, and in spirit. Ahead lies the story of New Spain, of missionaries and viceroys, of struggle and adaptation, of sorrow and resilience. The tale of Mexico was far from over. It had only entered a new age. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a long and complex new chapter. From the ashes of the Aztec Empire, Spain began to build what it called Nueva España, New Spain. Where pyramids had once risen, cathedrals would be raised. Where Nahuatl had sung through the streets, Spanish would slowly become the language of power. Yet, beneath these changes, the spirit of the land and its people endured, weaving itself quietly into the new order. In the first years after the conquest, the landscape of central Mexico was transformed. ruins of Tenochtitlan became the foundation for Mexico City, the capital of New Spain. Spanish stones were laid upon indigenous foundations. Temples were dismantled to provide materials for churches and palaces. The Plaza Mayor, now called the Zocalo, became the heart of the new city, where markets, ceremonies, and decrees unfolded beneath the watch of Spanish governors and priests. The Spanish crown sought to impose order and authority. A system of encomiendas granted land and the labor of indigenous people to Spanish settlers, who were expected, in theory, to care for and Christianize them. In practice, this often led to exploitation, harsh labor, and suffering. The once powerful Mexica and their neighbors now lived under new masters, yet they carried within them traditions that could not be erased. Religion became the center of colonial transformation. Missionaries, particularly Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, arrived with zeal to spread Christianity. They built churches and monasteries across the land, sometimes directly on top of ancient temples. They taught prayers, hymns, and catechisms, replacing old rituals with new sacraments. Yet conversion was not simply one-sided. Indigenous people blended their beliefs with Catholic practices, creating a unique form of spirituality. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who appeared in 1531 to the Nahua convert Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac, became a symbol of this fusion. A holy figure who carried both Spanish Catholic and indigenous meanings, uniting the old and the new. Life in New Spain was marked by a rigid social order. At the top were Spaniards born in Europe, known as peninsulars. Beneath them were Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas. Then came mestizos, of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, whose numbers grew over the centuries. Indigenous peoples, once rulers of their own empires, now formed the majority at the base of society, along with African slaves brought to the colonies. This hierarchy, though unequal, created a new society unlike any that had come before. A society of blending, adaptation, and resilience. Economically, New Spain became one of the most important regions of the Spanish Empire. Silver mines in Zacatecas and Guanajuato poured wealth into the coffers of Spain, financing wars and palaces across Europe. Agricultural estates, or haciendas, spread across the land, producing maize, wheat, cattle, and sugar. Trade linked Mexico to the wider world. From the port of Veracruz, goods sailed to Spain, while from Acapulco, the Manila galleons carried silver to Asia and returned with silk, porcelain, and spices. Mexico stood at the crossroads of a global network, a place where Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia all met. Yet wealth for some meant hardship for others. Indigenous people labored in fields and mines under harsh conditions. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and typhus devastated communities, reducing populations to a fraction of their pre-conquest numbers. Entire towns disappeared, and with them languages, traditions, and histories. Still, the survivors endured. They rebuilt villages, maintained their dances, their songs, and their ways of seeing the world, even as they adapted to new realities. Education and culture also took root in New Spain. Universities and schools were founded, teaching theology, philosophy, and the arts. Scholars such as Bernardino de Sahagún worked with indigenous informants to record the traditions, languages, and knowledge of Mesoamerica, creating works that preserved invaluable memories of the past. Painters and sculptors blended European styles with indigenous techniques, giving rise to a unique colonial art. Churches were filled with golden altarpieces, while everyday objects carried both Spanish and native designs. Daily life in New Spain was rich and varied. In the markets, one could find maize and beans alongside wheat and cattle. Spanish music blended with indigenous rhythms, and African influences added new layers to dance and song. Festivals brought people together, mixing Catholic saints' days with indigenous celebrations, filling plazas with color, music, and devotion. The streets of Mexico City echoed with many languages: Spanish, Nahuatl, Maya, Mixtec, Zapotec, all carrying the voices of a diverse people. Over the centuries, tensions grew within this colonial world. The Criollos, though of Spanish blood, were often treated as second class compared to peninsulars. Indigenous communities resisted taxes and forced labor, sometimes rising in rebellion. Enslaved Africans sought freedom and created communities of escape. Beneath the surface of order lay currents of dissatisfaction, currents that would eventually lead to calls for independence. But in the long centuries of colonial rule, there was also creativity, resilience, and transformation. Out of the blending of peoples emerged a new culture, mestizo, both European and indigenous, carrying African and Asian threads as well. Food reflected this blending. Maize tortillas filled with pork brought by Spaniards, chocolate mixed with sugar from distant islands, chilies seasoned with spices from across the seas. Language itself absorbed new words and expressions, shaping the Spanish of Mexico into something distinct and living. The colonial era was not only about domination, but also about endurance. Indigenous towns preserved their councils, their dances, their festivals. Healers carried forward knowledge of plants and medicine. Artists carved, painted, and sang, often embedding their own meanings within Christian forms. The people of New Spain lived between worlds, creating something entirely their own. As the 18th century dawned, the winds of change began to stir. Enlightenment, ideas of reason and rights, reached the Americas. Economic pressures deepened inequality, and resentment against Spain's control grew stronger among Criollos. The empire that had seemed eternal began to show cracks. But for now, as we close this chapter, we linger in the colonial plazas where bells ring for mass, where merchants sell their goods beneath wooden arches, where children chase one another through dusty streets, and where ancient traditions still whisper beneath the surface of Spanish rule. The story of New Spain is one of sorrow and survival, of imposition and invention, worlds colliding and then blending into something new. Ahead lies the story of independence, of voices that rose to claim freedom, of struggles that would reshape Mexico once again. For just as empires fall, so too do colonies give way to nations, and the people of Mexico were preparing, slowly and quietly, for the dawn of their own. The 18th century brought quiet changes to New Spain, changes that at first seemed like ripples, but would soon swell into waves strong enough to reshape an entire land. For 300 years, colonial order had endured. Spanish kings ruled from afar, their viceroys governed in Mexico City, and the people lived within a rigid hierarchy of race and class. Yet, beneath this apparent stability, discontent grew steadily. By the late 1700s, the time of colonies unquestioningly obeying their masters was drawing to an end. The world itself was changing. Across the seas, new ideas were being spoken, ideas of liberty, equality, and rights. The Enlightenment spread through books and whispered conversations, carried by merchants, priests, and travelers. The American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789, and even uprisings in other parts of Latin America planted seeds of hope. If distant peoples could claim freedom, why not New Spain? The Creole population, Spaniards born in Mexico, began to feel the weight of exclusion. They shared ancestry with the peninsulars who ruled, yet they were denied the highest offices and treated as lesser. They were wealthy landowners, educated scholars, proud of their heritage, but their ambitions were stifled by Spanish laws. Resentment grew quietly at first, expressed in salons and writings, but soon found stronger voices. Indigenous communities, too, carried centuries of grief. They had survived disease, forced labor, and cultural suppression. Many villages struggled under taxes and tribute demanded by both crown and church. Some had lost their lands to haciendas that grew larger each decade. And yet, the memory of freedom, of ancient autonomy, had never been erased. Their prayers and dances still spoke to the earth and the ancestors, whispering of a time when they governed themselves. Into this landscape of inequality and hope stepped leaders who would ignite the flame of independence. The most famous among them was a parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. He was a man of education, a reader of forbidden Enlightenment texts, and a believer that his people deserved more than submission to a distant king. In his small town of Dolores, Hidalgo gathered allies, Creoles dissatisfied with their status, mestizos hungry for opportunity, and indigenous villagers weary of hardship. The moment came in September 1810. The Spanish crown was weakened, invaded by Napoleon in Europe, leaving its colonies uncertain of who truly ruled. On the night of September 15th, Hidalgo rang the church bell in Dolores, summoning the people. His words, remembered as El Grito de Dolores, called for the end of Spanish rule, for justice, for land, and for New Mexico. Viva la Virgen de Guadalupe! Mura el mal gobierno, the people shouted. Long live the Virgin of Guadalupe! Death to bad government! revolution had begun. The response was swift and passionate. Thousands of villagers, peasants, and townspeople joined Hidalgo, carrying farm tools, machetes, and a few muskets. They marched under the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a symbol uniting faith and freedom. Town after town fell to their growing army, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though independence might come quickly. But the road to freedom was not so simple. The Spanish forces, better trained and equipped, struck back. Battles were fierce, and victories turned to defeats. Hidalgo himself was captured in 1811, executed, and his head displayed in Guanajuato as a warning. Yet the flame he lit did not die. Others carried it forward: Ignacio Allende, Jose Maria Morelos, Vicente Guerrero, each adding strength to the cause. Jose Maria Morelos, another priest, proved to be both a military leader and a visionary. He organized armies, won important battles, and drafted documents calling for equality, an end to slavery, and the creation of a republic. His dream was larger than rebellion. It was the birth of a nation built on justice. Though he, too, was captured and executed in 1815, his vision inspired countless others. The struggle dragged on for more than a decade, marked by victories and defeats, hopes and setbacks. Villages were burned, lives were lost, and the land itself bore the scars of war. Yet the idea of independence became a part of the people's soul. By the 1820s, even some Spanish loyalists began to question the future. The empire in Europe was weakening, and the tide of history was moving toward change. In 1821, the final chapter of the war arrived. Agustin de Iturbide, once a royalist commander, made an unexpected turn. Realizing that independence was inevitable, he forged an alliance with Vicente Guerrero, one of the leading insurgent fighters. Together, they created the Plan of Iguala, which promised independence, unity between Creoles and Peninsulars, and the protection of Catholic faith. The Army of the Three Guarantees, representing religion, independence, and unity, marched triumphantly into Mexico City in September 1821. The colonial era, after 3 centuries, was over. New Spain was no more. Mexico was born. The first years of independence were uncertain, filled with questions about what kind of nation Mexico would become. Iturbide briefly crowned himself emperor, only to be overthrown. A republic followed, fragile and divided. Yet, despite the struggles, something irreversible had happened. The people of Mexico had claimed their right to self-determination. They were no longer subjects of a distant king. They were citizens of a new nation. The fight for independence was not just a war of battles and leaders. It was a struggle of identity. It brought together people of different backgrounds: Creole, Mestizo, Indigenous, African, under a shared cause. It reawakened memories of ancient autonomy and planted hopes for a future of justice. Though imperfect and incomplete, independence opened the path for Mexico to define itself, to write its own history, and to seek its own destiny. As we let this chapter rest, we hear still the echoes of bells and dolors, the cries of villagers marching beneath the Virgin's banner, the clash of steel on battlefields, and the prayers whispered in silence. The fight for independence was long and painful, but it was also filled with courage, vision, and an unshakable belief in freedom. Ahead lies another challenge, for independence was only the beginning. The 19th century would bring wars, invasions, reforms, and revolutions as Mexico struggled to find stability and shape its identity. Yet the story of independence remains a guiding light. The moment when the people of Mexico stood together and declared, once and for all, that this land was theirs. When Mexico declared its independence in 1821, a new dawn had arrived, but it was a dawn filled with uncertainty. The bells of dolors and the banners of the Virgin of Guadalupe had united a people in their struggle. Yet victory brought more questions than answers. What kind of nation would Mexico be? Who would govern it? And how could such a diverse, wounded land find unity after centuries of colonial rule? The first steps were hesitant. Agustin de Iturbide, the general who had joined Vicente Guerrero to secure independence, declared himself Emperor of Mexico. His rule, however, was short-lived. The empire collapsed in less than a year, replaced by a fragile republic. From the beginning, Mexico's journey was marked by turbulence. The early republic was divided between two visions. On one side were the centralists, who wanted a strong central government to hold the nation together. On the other side were the federalists, who sought greater autonomy for the states. These divisions were not merely political. They reflected the complexities of a vast country with many regions, cultures, and needs. The clash between centralism and federalism became a recurring theme, shaping Mexico's destiny throughout the century. Economic challenges weighed heavily. After years of war, the land was scarred, mines were abandoned, and trade was disrupted. The young nation struggled to find stability. Taxes were hard to collect, armies were costly to maintain, and foreign debts piled up. Yet, amid these difficulties, the Mexican people carried on, farmers planting maize, artisans crafting their goods, families gathering in plazas, and communities holding on to traditions that gave them strength. Foreign powers, watching from afar, saw both opportunity and weakness. Spain tried and failed to retake its former colony. France and Britain kept close eyes on Mexico's trade and resources, and the United States, growing rapidly to the north, looked with increasing interest at Mexican territory. This interest soon turned into conflict. In 1836, the region of Texas, then part of Mexico, declared independence after a rebellion supported by settlers from the United States. The battles of the Alamo and San Jacinto became legendary, and Mexico, weakened by internal strife, could not hold on. Texas was lost, a wound that cut deep into Mexican pride, but greater trials still lay ahead. In 1846, war broke out between Mexico and the United States. It was a war Mexico did not seek, but could not avoid. The armies of the United States advanced, and despite the bravery of Mexican soldiers, the outcome was devastating. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo forced Mexico to cede nearly half of its territory. Vast lands that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The loss was immense. A nation born with such hope now found itself diminished and humiliated. Yet, within this sorrow, the people of Mexico endured. They sang songs of resistance, told stories of fallen heroes, and carried forward the belief that their nation, though wounded, would not disappear. As the century progressed, Mexico faced not only external threats, but also deep internal struggles. The question of reform, who should own the land, how power should be shared, what role the church should play, became urgent. The Catholic Church, which had been a powerful institution since colonial times, still controlled vast lands and wealth. Many reformers believed that for Mexico to move forward, the church's influence needed to be reduced. This struggle came to a head in the 1850s, during what is known as La Reforma. Leaders such as Benito Juarez, a Zapotec from Oaxaca who rose to the presidency, sought to modernize the nation. Juarez and his allies passed laws to separate church and state, redistribute land, and affirm equality before the law. Their vision was of a Mexico where citizenship mattered more than ancestry, where justice was not reserved for the privileged few, but extended to all. La Reforma, however, was met with resistance. Conservatives, who defended tradition and the power of the church, opposed the liberals at every step. Civil war erupted, dividing communities, families, and the nation itself. The struggle was not only about laws, but about the soul of Mexico, whether it would cling to the structures of the past or step into a new, uncertain future. In the midst of this conflict, foreign powers once again intervened. France, under Emperor Napoleon III, sought to establish influence in the Americas. Taking advantage of Mexico's instability, French troops invaded in the 1860s. They installed Archduke Maximilian of Austria as Emperor of Mexico, believing he could rule as a European monarch. Yet the people of Mexico did not yield. Under the leadership of Benito Juarez and countless local fighters, they resisted. The Battle of Puebla in 1862 became a symbol of Mexican courage, when a smaller Mexican force defeated the French army. Though the French would occupy Mexico City for a time, the resistance never ended. By 1867, Maximilian was captured and executed, and the Republic was restored. Juarez's triumph symbolized the resilience of Mexico, a nation that, though invaded and divided, refused to surrender its identity. His presidency marked a turning point, affirming that Mexico's destiny would be shaped not by foreign emperors, but by its own people. Still, peace was fleeting. After Juarez's death, new challenges arose. The latter part of the century saw the rise of Porfirio Diaz, a general who seized power in 1876. His rule, known as the Porfiriato, would last for more than 3 decades. Diaz brought order, modernized the economy, and encouraged foreign investment. Railroads stretched across the land, cities grew, and industries expanded. To many, it seemed as though Mexico had finally found stability. Yet beneath the surface, inequalities deepened. Indigenous communities lost their lands, peasants faced harsh conditions, and wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. The calm of Diaz's long rule was, in truth, a silence imposed by force, not a harmony born of justice. The seeds of discontent that would one day bloom into revolution were already being planted. As the 19th century drew to a close, Mexico stood at a crossroads. It had endured wars, invasions, and internal strife. It had lost land, but had never lost its spirit. It had fought for reform and resisted empires. It had survived time and again by the strength of its people. Their resilience, their creativity, their enduring hope. And now, with a new century dawning, that hope would once more be tested. For the struggles of the past had not disappeared. They had only changed shape. Ahead lay a storm that would shake Mexico to its core. The Great Revolution of 1910, a movement that would bring both pain and renewal, and forever change the nation's path. As the 20th century began, Mexico appeared stable on the surface. Railroads stretched across the countryside, linking cities and towns in ways never seen before. Mines and factories produced wealth. Foreign investors praised the order and progress of the land. In Mexico City, grand boulevards and elegant buildings gave the impression of prosperity. Yet, behind this image of success lay deep wounds, quiet resentments, and silent hungers that could no longer be ignored. The long rule of Porfirio Diaz, known as the Porfiriato, had brought modernity, but also inequality. For over 30 years, Diaz held power, first through elections, then through manipulation, and finally through sheer control. His motto was order and progress, and indeed, he maintained peace. But it was a peace built on the silence of dissent. The wealthy elite, both Mexican and foreign, benefited from Diaz's policies. Vast haciendas spread across the land, owned by a small number of families. Railroads carried crops, silver, and oil out of the country, enriching investors in Europe and the United States. But for millions of peasants and indigenous villagers, life grew harder. Many lost their ancestral lands, forced to work on haciendas for low wages. Others toiled in mines and factories under harsh conditions, with little hope of change. By the first decade of the century, frustration simmered everywhere. The poor longed for land and justice. Workers demanded fair wages. Intellectuals and students called for democracy. Even some among the middle and upper classes began to question Diaz's endless rule. Into this atmosphere stepped Francisco I. Madero, a wealthy but idealistic landowner who believed in democracy. In 1910, he challenged Diaz in the presidential election, calling for free and fair voting. Diaz, unwilling to surrender power, had Madero arrested. But the spirit of democracy had already been awakened. From prison and later from exile in the United States, Madero issued the plan of San Luis Potosi, calling for Mexicans to rise up against Diaz on November 20, 1910. And rise they did. In villages, towns, and farms, people took up arms. Some fought with rifles, others with machetes, and many with only determination. Among the leaders who emerged were Emiliano Zapata in the south and Pancho Villa in the north, two figures who would become legendary. Zapata, from the state of Morelos, carried the cry of Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. He fought not for political power, but for the rights of peasants to reclaim their stolen lands. His vision was rooted in the soil, in the communities that had lived on their land for generations. Villa, meanwhile, led fierce cavalry in the north, drawing followers from cowboys, laborers, and the poor. Bold, charismatic, and daring, Villa became a symbol of resistance against both dictatorship and injustice. The revolution quickly spread. Diaz, unable to contain the uprisings, resigned in 1911 and went into exile. For the first time in decades, Mexico had the chance to reshape its future. Madero became president, carrying the hopes of reform and democracy. Yet, governing a fractured nation proved more difficult than winning it. Madero's moderate policies disappointed radicals who wanted deeper change, while conservatives resisted any reform at all. His government struggled to satisfy peasants like Zapata, who demanded immediate land redistribution. Discontent grew, and in 1913, Madero was betrayed. General Victoriano Huerta seized power in a coup, and Madero was assassinated. A wave of grief and anger swept the nation. The revolution deepened. Zapata continued his fight in the south, issuing the Plan of Ayala, demanding land for the peasants. Villa gathered his armies in the north, battling Huerta's forces with relentless energy. Other leaders, such as Venustiano Carranza and Alvaro Obregón, joined the struggle, each with their own vision for Mexico's future. The revolution became not a single movement, but many, woven together by the shared determination to end tyranny. Huerta's regime, harsh and brutal, soon collapsed under pressure from revolutionary forces and international isolation. Yet even after his fall, unity proved elusive. The revolutionaries, once allies against dictatorship, turned against each other. Battles raged between Villa, Zapata, Carranza, and Obregón, each seeking to guide the nation in a different direction. Through the years of fighting, Mexico was scarred. Cities were torn by conflict, railroads destroyed, fields left untended. Families endured hardship, displacement, and loss. Yet through it all, the dream of a more just Mexico sustained the struggle. In 1917, Carranza oversaw the drafting of a new constitution, a remarkable document for its time. It promised land reform, labor rights, limits on foreign ownership, and separation of church and state. It declared education free and secular, and it gave workers the right to strike. Though not all its promises were immediately fulfilled, the Constitution of 1917 became a cornerstone of modern Mexico, a symbol of the revolution's ideals written into law. Even so, fighting did not end at once. Zapata continued to press for genuine land reform until his assassination in 1919. Villa fought on until he, too, eventually laid down arms, only to be killed in 1923. Carranza himself was overthrown and killed, while Obregón emerged as president, guiding Mexico into a new phase of reconstruction. The revolution, which had begun in 1910, stretched across a decade of turmoil. It was not a single struggle, but a tapestry of battles, betrayals, victories, and defeats. It brought suffering, yet it also brought transformation. Out of the violence and sacrifice, a new Mexico emerged, a nation more conscious of its people, more committed to justice, more determined to define its own path. The legacy of the revolution was not only political, but also cultural. Artists, writers, and musicians gave voice to the spirit of the era. Murals painted by Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros filled walls with stories of peasants, workers, and revolutionaries. Corridos, folk ballads, sang of Villa, Zapata, and the struggles of ordinary people. The revolution lived not only in laws and battles, but in art, song, and memory. As the dust of the revolution settled, Mexico faced the task of rebuilding. The wounds of war would take time to heal, and not all dreams would be realized. Yet the revolution had planted seeds that would shape the 20th century. The demand for land, for justice, for dignity, and for a nation that belonged to its people. To reflect on the Mexican Revolution is to hear again the church bell of dolors, the cries of Tierra y Libertad, the thunder of cavalry across the plains, and the voices of countless men and women who rose to claim a better future. It is to see a land in struggle, yet also in hope, a land willing to endure hardship in the belief that tomorrow could be more just than today. And as this chapter closes, we feel Mexico standing at a threshold once more. The revolution has ended, but its echoes remain. Ahead lies a century of rebuilding, of finding stability, of balancing tradition and modernity. The voices of Zapata, Villa, and Madero fade into memory, yet their ideals linger, whispering still in the hearts of the Mexican people. The guns of the revolution fell silent in the 1920s, but their echoes lingered across valleys, deserts, and villages. Mexico had endured more than a decade of turmoil, and now it faced the long journey of rebuilding. The dreams of Madero, Zapata, and Villa were carved into memory, and though not all had been fulfilled, their spirit lingered. A nation scarred by war sought healing, balance, and renewal. In the years that followed, leaders struggled to bring stability. Alvaro Obregón, who emerged from the revolution, guided Mexico toward reconstruction. Land reform began, though slowly, as communities regained pieces of their lost inheritance. Schools were built, bringing education to children who had long been denied learning. A a sense of national pride grew, rooted not only in the victories of the revolution, but in the deeper layers of Mexico's history. From the pyramids of Teotihuacan to the wisdom of the Maya, from the resilience of the Aztecs to the blending of worlds in the colonial era, the 1930s brought further change under President Lázaro Cárdenas. With determination and vision, he carried forward the promises of the revolution. He redistributed millions of acres of land to peasants, creating ejidos, communal farms that gave villagers a stake in their own future. He strengthened workers' rights, supported unions, and in 1938 made a bold decision: the nationalization of Mexico's oil industry. Foreign companies had long profited from the nation's resources, but now petroleum was declared the property of the Mexican people. It was a moment of sovereignty, of reclaiming dignity, and it echoed the revolutionary cry that Mexico belonged to Mexicans. Cárdenas's reforms left a lasting mark. They inspired hope among the poor and pride among the working classes. For a time, it seemed that the revolution's promises were finding fulfillment. Yet challenges persisted. The path of justice is never simple, and the inequalities of centuries could not be erased overnight. As the mid-20th century unfolded, Mexico entered a period of relative stability under the rule of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. For decades, the PRI dominated politics, presenting itself as the guardian of revolutionary ideals. It oversaw industrial growth, urbanization, and modernization. Cities expanded, highways spread across the land, and Mexico became a leader among Latin American nations. But this long stability came with contradictions. While many enjoyed progress, others remained in poverty. While the PRI promised democracy, its rule often silenced opposition and controlled elections. The voice of the people, so powerfully raised during the revolution, sometimes felt muffled under the weight of one-party rule. Yet the culture of Mexico continued to flourish. Writers like Octavio Paz explored the depths of identity, memory, and modern life. Artists carried forward the muralist tradition, filling walls with colors that told stories of struggle and hope. Musicians blended traditional mariachi with new sounds, creating melodies that spoke both to the past and the future. Everyday life was rich with celebration. Dia de los Muertos, altars glowing with candles, markets bursting with flavors, plazas alive with laughter and song. The second half of the century brought both triumphs and sorrows. In 1968, as Mexico prepared to host the Olympic Games, student protests called for greater democracy and freedoms. The tragic events at Tlatelolco, where many were killed, revealed the tensions between authority and the people. It was a wound, a reminder that beneath modern progress, the longing for true democracy endured. Natural disasters also tested the nation. The earthquake of 1985 shook Mexico City, bringing devastation, but also revealing the courage and solidarity of its people. ordinary citizens rushed to rescue neighbors, forming brigades of hope amid the rubble. In tragedy, the spirit of community, so deeply rooted in Mexican culture, shone brightly. As the century turned, Mexico entered new challenges and opportunities. Economic reforms, trade agreements such as NAFTA, and globalization reshaped the nation's role in the world. Cities grew rapidly, technology advanced, and Mexico's voice on the international stage grew stronger. At the same time, poverty, inequality, and political corruption remained struggles yet to be overcome. But beyond politics and economics, Mexico's greatest strength lay in its people, in their resilience, creativity, and warmth. The faces of children running through plazas, the songs sung in small villages, the crafts woven with care, the food shared around family tables, all spoke of a spirit that no hardship could extinguish. The 21st century brought change in leadership. As the PRI's long dominance gave way to new parties and shifting politics, democracy, once only a dream of revolutionaries, became a living, if imperfect, reality. The nation continued to navigate challenges, violence, inequality, migration. Yet it also celebrated its growing influence in culture, art, and ideas. To speak of modern Mexico is to speak of contrasts. Bustling cities and quiet villages, ancient traditions and modern innovations, challenges endured and joys celebrated. It is to see pyramids standing beside skyscrapers, markets filled with centuries-old recipes, alongside digital screens glowing with new possibilities. But above all, to speak of modern Mexico is to feel the heartbeat of its people, a heartbeat that has endured through conquest, colony, independence, wars, and revolutions. It is a rhythm of resilience, carrying the echoes of ancestors while reaching toward the future. Mexico today stands not only as a nation with borders and institutions, but as a living memory of all that has come before. The Olmec carvings, the Maya pyramids, the Aztec city on the lake, the colonial churches, the cries of independence, the murals of revolution. All these layers live together in its soul. Each generation adds its own voice, weaving the story onward. And so, as we close this final chapter, we linger not on battles or politics alone, but on the enduring spirit of Mexico. A spirit of community, of family, of tradition, of joy even in hardship. A spirit that lights candles for the dead yet celebrates life with color and laughter. A spirit that welcomes strangers with warmth, that dances to rhythms both ancient and new, that never forgets its roots while reaching toward the skies. Mexico's history is vast, filled with struggles and triumphs, but through it all runs a single thread: the unbroken will of its people to endure, to create, and to hope. From the first settlements of ancient times to the modern streets of today, Mexico has been, and will always be, a land of everlasting spirit.